Welcome back, everyone. This is Rabbi Nathan Zaboulani with Parasha Study Plus, learning the commentary of Rabbenu Avraham ben Harambam on Parashat Haye. Our topic today will be Yishak and meditation, and we'll see 4 lessons that he brings for us. First, focusing on the pasuk, Ve'yitzhak ba mibo be'er lahai ro'i. Yitzhak was on his way back from going to Be'er Lahai Ro'i. This was a well in which Borei Olam previously through an angel appeared to Hagar and Yishmael when they were banished and then were saved. V'hu Yoshev be'eretz HaNegev. But really Yitzhak was living with Avraham in Eretz HaNegev in the southern part of Israel, which is referring to Hebron and to Be'er Sheva. But either way, Yitzhak went to this place, Be'er Lahai Ro'i, and says Rabbenu Avraham on this, there was a very large distance. It was very far away from where they lived in the south. Rabbenu Avraham teaches us this concept of hitbodedut, which really means isolation, separation, meditation, in which the tzaddikim and the nevi'im would very often go to places that were uninhabited, getting away from society, and they would isolate themselves in order to connect with Borei Olam. Rabbenu Avraham discusses 2 different types of hitbodedut. Hitbodedut chitzonit, which was isolation from society, was actually getting up and going somewhere else, or staying within and isolating yourself from society, or hitbodedut penimit, which was isolating yourself from any foreign thoughts, completely removing anything that is other than connecting with Borei Olam from your mind and from your thoughts. That is the topic of hitbodedut, in which it seems as though Yitzchak, according to Rabbenu Avraham, was engaging in. To supplement a little bit from Sefer Hamaspik Le'ovdei Hashem of Rabbenu Avraham, he says that with hitbodedut chitzonit, there's 2 different types or categories within hitbodedut chitzonit. He says there's total hitbodedut chitzonit, in which you would separate yourself and go to an isolated desert, mountain, or uninhabited area, or there was partial, which would be to isolate yourself in your home. He quotes the pasuk for Yaakov, that Yaakov was Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. What does that mean, Yoshev Ohalim? That he would isolate himself from society in his home in order to connect with Hashem. It might be frequent, this isolation, or occasional. It could be for a long period of time or for a very short period of time. But Rabbenu Avraham says that it was impossible or even forbidden in this world for someone to completely isolate themselves and retreat in this form of connecting with Hashem through hitbodedut, that it was in fact forbidden. Interestingly, in the Cairo Geniza, we have a letter from a woman about 100 years after the time of Rabbenu Avraham, where Rabbenu Avraham lived in Cairo. And in this Cairo Geniza finding, the woman is sending a letter to the leaders of the Jewish community and pleading to them to bring back her husband, to bring him back because he was going too often to these mountains and deserts and isolating himself and essentially performing this hitbodedut that Rabbenu Avraham is mentioning here. And Rabbenu Avraham is very clear that must be done in moderation, in a proper way, not complete retreat from family life and everything, but rather it needs to be done at different intervals of time in a moderated way. And we see that Rabbenu Avraham was in fact speaking to a trend that was taking place in Egypt, in where he lived at the time, in which there was an extremism of this hitbodedut. Rabbenu Avraham is very, very pro hitbodedut, but of course to be done in a healthy and an appropriate way. He brings many examples from Tanakh of individuals who did hitbodedut, starting with Hanoch in between the generations of Adam and Noach. This Hanoch, it says, Vaytalech Hanoch et Elohim. And there he explains that Hanoch, in fact, performed hitbodedut. You have many examples of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Moshe through their shepherding, in which they were isolated from society. The Dor Hamidbar, 40 years in the desert, they were isolated from all different types of societies. Yehoshua, when he was on the mountain of Har Sinai, in between Moshe and Am Yisrael, had his own set of hitbodedut. You have Shemuel, who was in the Mishkan and was isolated from all other types of society when he was living in the Mishkan as a young boy under the tutelage of Eli. Also, that's an example of hitbodedut. Eliyahu and Elisha, many examples there in those stories. And even interestingly, he says Bil'am, when he goes on top of the mountain in order to do whatever he wants to do towards Bnei Israel, he says that that was also his version and his form of hitbodedut, of isolation, in order to connect with Hashem. To summarize this idea, the tzaddikim and the nevi'im were at times They would isolate themselves and do hitbodedut in order to connect with Hashem. And just one last thought on this topic. From Rabbi Dr. Ezra Labatan alav shalom in his dissertation on Rabbeinu Avraham, he notes how there were many people who considered Rabbeinu Avraham to have been influenced by Sufi mystics. Sufi mysticism was something that was very popular in the time of Rabbeinu Avraham, and they themselves did do things like this, like hitbodedut, like isolation, and they were very pious, they were very ascetic. And many people considered Rabbeinu Avraham to have learned these ideas from Sufi mystics. So Rabbi Dr. Ezra Labatan alav shalom says Rabbeinu Avraham was well aware of the Sufi reliance on these prophetic models. Hence, it would seem that Rabbeinu Avraham did not view himself as imitating any particular school of Sufi thought, nor was he trying to borrow their practices. He wasn't copying the Sufis. His admiration and imitation stemmed from his conviction that they were the closest contemporary models of his own source of students of the prophetic school, Bnei HaNevi'im. Rabbeinu Avraham viewed the Bnei HaNevi'im, the practices of the Nevi'im, as performing hitbodedut as the source for the Sufis, and not the Sufis of the source of these things. From his point of view, he was only restoring the crown of pietism to the rightful place. He wasn't copying the Sufis, he was copying the Nevi'im. The Sufis were copying these examples of the Nevi'im. And elsewhere, Rabbeinu Avraham says that just because the Goyim do certain things doesn't mean that that's off for us. If the Goyim stand during their prayers, does that mean that we're not allowed to stand? If the Goyim bow during their prayers, does that mean that we're not allowed to bow? But rather, these are authentically Jewish practices that were sort of lost along the way and were picked up by these Sufis. And Rabbeinu Avraham is just bringing back what was authentically, fundamentally Jewish. That is the topic of hitbodedut. Moving on, he also discusses a very interesting diligence that Yitzhak had for his service of Hashem. You'll notice that the pasuk does tell us that he was in Be'er Lahairoi doing this meditation, but it specifically mentions that he wasn't on his way there, but rather he was on his way back. Why do we need to know that Yitzhak was on his way back? Why is that detail important? And he says that the importance of that detail is lehodia leba'alei Torah shelo haya Yitzchak yotze la'avodah v'chazar mimena b'shvil shegi'a Rivka im Eliezer. If Yitzchak was on his way, he would not have stopped in order to engage in this with Rivka at that point, but rather he was on his way back. But if he was going, he would not have stopped in order to deal with Rivka. He would have continued on his way. He would have finished what he had set himself out to do. He was so focused and so serious about his service of Hashem that he would not have interrupted it for anything. And says Rabbeinu Avraham, this is a musar for all those who are studies of Torah, that if this is what you do, if this is your activity, if you take this seriously, you will not be distracted for anything. Just like Yitzhak would not have been distracted if he was going on his way, he only was coming back, and that's why he interrupted in order to deal with Eliezer, Eved Avraham, and Rivka. So the summary of idea number 2 is that Yitzhak was on his way back, as the pasuk testifies, and that is to teach us that had he been on his way there to serve Hashem, he would not have interrupted it for anything, not even for the prospect of marriage. Idea number 3 discusses a very interesting topic of the spirituality of location. Rabbeinu Avraham says that there was a uniqueness to the location that Yitzhak went to. He specifically went to Be'er Lahairoi because it had some kind of a kedusha, some kind of a spirituality to that location, and that's why he went there. He was able to connect with Hashem more in that specific location. He also brings the example of Yaakov when he says, "Ein zeh ki im bet Elohim," that this location was Bet Elohim, that specific spot was very prone, was very spiritual, was very facilitating to the connection of Hashem. And this idea that certain locations, the tzaddikim and the nevi'im were drawn to, not just isolating themselves from society, but isolating themselves to specific locations that had this ability to improve their connection with Borei Olam, is a unique idea that we see from Rabbeinu Avraham as expressed through his commentary regarding Yitzhak. At certain locations, we know the Beit HaMikdash, for example, we know that the location of the Mishkan are places of connection with Hashem, but he's saying over here that there were other locations, other places that Nevi'im would flock to, and that would give them inspiration in their service of Borei Olam. This is a very unique idea. Summary of idea number 3, and idea number 4 is beautiful on the topic of Vayhi Acharei Mot Avraham, after Avraham dies at the end of the Parasha. Vayivarech Elohim et Yitzchak, God blesses Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Vayeshev Yitzchak im be'er lahai ro'i. What does Yitzchak do? The first thing we find out Yitzchak does after Avraham dies is Yitzchak moves to Be'er Lahai Ro'i, and says Rabbenu Avraham, Haye Avraham lo haya yachol lipared mimenu. Yitzchak would not separate from his father. Rather, he would commute. Haya chozer v'shav me'etzel aviv el ha'ba'er umin etzel aviv. He would go back and forth from his father to the Be'er and then come back to his father. Ushnistalek Avraham. But once Avraham Avinu alav shalom went to Olam Ha'emet, Yitzchak went and permanently moved to Be'er Lahai Ro'i, as his designated spot, because he had a connection with that. But we learn over here that Yitzchak would never leave Abraham's side completely. It's only after Abraham passed, out of respect for Abraham as his father, out of respect for Abraham, his teacher, he would never leave his side, even though he had a very strong connection with a different location. He would commute in order to always stay by Abraham's side, and only after Abraham passed did he actually pick up and move to that location of Be'er Lahai Ro'i. These are the 4 ideas that we learned from Yitzchak by Rabbenu Avraham ben Harambam on Parashat Haye. For more classes, please visit TanakhStudy.com. Thank you very much for joining us on the commentary of Rabbenu Avraham for this week. Please join us for next week as well. Thank you very much and have a great day.